The COLLE system. The COLLE system is a kingside opening that begins as a queen pawn. White first places a pawn at d4, but then builds up behind his e-pawn to force the advance e3 to e4. In this way, he obtains the advantage on the kingside, which often leads to a powerful attack. To give you an idea of some of the themes of this opening, let's look at a game COLLE versus Riley from Barcelona 1935. This game began 1d4, black knight f6, white knight f3. Black plays pawn to b6. Now, in many of the lines of the COLLE, black defends with d7 to d5. In fact, if you were playing this opening 50 years ago, that's what you'd expect 80% of the time. But the modern player must expect his opponent to choose from a number of setups, all quite playable. In that case, he must try to follow his plans through, but not be too rigid about them. Occasionally, he must be prepared to switch to a wholly different plan of campaign. Flexibility is vitally important nowadays. White continued in this game with pawn to e3. Black played bishop b7. White bishop to d3. Black pawn from c7 to c5. White knight from b1 to d2. And black knight from b8 to c6. White now played c2 to c3. White's last few moves are the trademarks of the COLLE system. He plays his bishop to d3 and moves his pawn from c2 to c3. He intends to play e3 to e4 later, after he's completed part of his development. Then, after his pawn's on e4, he needs to have his pawn at d4 supported. So that's why he plays c2 to c3. Note an interesting fact. Many of White's pieces are developed so they attack the e4 square, the bishop at d3 and the knight at d2. And these can be joined later by a white queen coming to e2 and a white rook coming to e1. What gives the COLLE such advantages is that all these moves correspond to standard principles of development. The bishop and knight have moved just once and attacked the center. White's queen on e2 would be off the back row, which allows the rooks to be connected, and after e3 to e4, often finds herself on a central half-open file. Added to this, White castles, and his rook can quickly move to the center, possibly to e1. The one blot on White's copybook is the undeveloped bishop at c1, which also shuts in the white rook. In many openings, however, it's not much use to develop the bishop too early, that is, the one at c1. And, in fact, in the COLLE, after White's played e3 to e4, the bishop then does get some life. Now, the game continued with black e7 to e6, and White played a2 to a3. Now, why White played this move, we shall soon see. Black moved queen d8 to c7, and White now moved up e3 to e4. Black now played c5 takes d4, and White c3 takes d4. Now we realize the first advantage of playing a2 to a3. Black cannot now move knight from c6 to b4, harassing the bishop at d3, and later following up by rook c8 with pressure down the c file. In fact, if I may be allowed to give black some advice, he should have kept the c-file closed, as he can't use it. Instead of capturing at d4, he'd have done better to play h7 to h6, possibly followed by g7 to g5, keeping his king in the center. In fact, also, I feel black's knight on c6 may have hopped out a bit too soon. It might have been better to delay that, bring the knight to d7 later, or c6, depending on the situation. So these are refinements, of course. Now, after the ninth move, black now plays bishop to e7. White castles, black castles, and white pawn from b2 to b4. This move shows us the second advantage of the move a2 a3, and white's game is going very well. He's developed his pieces, and he's got the two-pawn center, and as well as that, he's now clamping black on the queen side. Black's got no real counterplay there because he can't bring his knight from c6 to any intelligent square. It's interesting that white expands in the parts of the board where his king is not to be found, and the kingside shelter remains untouched. Black now continued rook a8 to c8, and white developed bishop c1 to b2. Black played d7 to d6. Of course, black could always have played at certain points d7 to d5, though with the white pawn at e4, this isn't really a positionally advantageous idea, because white would be able to push on from e4 to e5, and then white would have the makings of a kingside attack, as well as the fact that the black bishop at b7 will have been shut out of the game. So black decides to keep his options open by playing d7 to d6. White moved now rook a1 to c1. There is a tiny threat here to win a piece by b4 to b5. Black retreats his queen to b8. White plays queen d1 to e2. Black answered with rook f8 to e8. Always a good idea to put a rook on the same file as a queen, even if there are pawns and pieces in the way. You never know when the lines might get opened up in favor of your rook. Now white's completely mobilized his forces after 14 moves of play, and should be thinking of a plan. A lot of amateurs, when they get to this sort of situation, say, "What do I do now?" and in a sort of complaining voice, as though a master will suddenly produce a bolt from the blue. But actually, middle game plans have to be thought out quite carefully. You may get to a opening position, but don't expect it to play itself. Now, in these positions, you often have to construct a plan of your own. Now, Koltanovsky here could have made several pawn advances, but he holds back from them, as they might only give black posts for his pieces. For example, if he plays b4 to b5 immediately, that now allows black knight c6 to a5, and then black has got play down the c-file. It's better to keep black suppressed and deprived of play by maintaining the territory already acquired. Now white's actual move here was knight d2 to b3. And this move does plan b4 to b5, and it also has another plan. This is to play knight f3 to d2, and then follow that up with f4, f2 to f4, and then maybe later f5, starting the kingside attack. Now, this move doesn't make any concessions to black, and in fact, having nothing to bite on, black now actually goes astray. Possibly black should go knight f6 to d7 here, maybe calling white's bluff about the move b4, b5, which black could answer, knight c6 to a5, and even though he gets these double pawns on the a-file, he would gain, I feel, some counterplay. And moving the knight from f6 to d7 gets it out of the way of the e-pawn. It may come back to f8, and black will sort of play a cat and mouse game on the bottom two or three ranks, waiting for white to come forward. However, in this game, black was less expert at this game and made a rather bad slip. After white's knight to b3, he moved his bishop from e7 to f8. And this was the signal for white to immediately launch in for a typical Greek gift attack. He played pawn from e4 to e5. Black played knight f6 to d5. I'd like you now to switch off your tapes and decide what you'd play for white. White here played bishop d3 takes h7 check. It's a common idea of attack against a castled king position. The ingredients are the bishop at d3, and you usually have to have a pawn at e5, possibly a knight at f3, and a queen somewhere at e2 or d1. They have to be ready to follow up the initial sacrifice. Now black played king takes h7. Wasn't much good if he refused the sacrifice. If he played king h8, white could then either retreat the bishop and stay a pawn up, or try for more with knight f3 to g5. Now after king takes bishop, white played knight g5 check, second stage of the attack. You can see why black's bishop f8 move was a disaster, because on e7 the bishop could here have captured that knight at g5. Black moved his king from h7 to g6. If he goes back to g8, white plays queen h5, and that attacks two spots, the f7 pawn and the h7 point. And black won't be able to save himself. He might even be as bad as being mated, I think. So king to g6. After that, white plays queen g4. This again is standard attacking plan, because white now threatens discovered attack with the knight. Knight takes e6 check is the threat. Black plays f7 to f5. Right, how would you now play for white? Well, it's not good here to take en passant at this point. Black would take back with his knight and hit the white queen, and he might even survive this attack. Instead, white played very strong move queen to h4, and this threatens to bring the queen down to h7 soon. If black's bishop was not on f8, he could defend against this move by playing rook to h8, and in that case queen h4 would not have been played. White would have played something like queen g3. But here queen h4 can be played, as there's no danger from black playing rook h8. See, interesting feature of the position, how black's pieces are stuck on the queen side, particularly his queen. Not too badly placed on b8, but rather away from the main scene of action at the moment. Now black had to play knight d5 to f6. Well, if he hadn't done that move, white would have played queen h7 check, and after king takes knight, white would have played f4 check, and black would have been quickly mated. So knight d5 to f6, giving back his booty, but, well, his king is still in a bad way. So white just played e5 takes f6, black king g6 takes f6. Again, if he'd have taken with the pawn, queen h7 check would have led to a rapid mate. So king takes f6. Now this looks pretty exciting position for white. He's got loads of discovered checks available with his knight and even with his pawn from d4. But you turn off your tapes and try and find a really clear line for white. Now, discovered attacks by the knight at g5 don't seem to lead anywhere. In fact, it's often a good idea not to play your trumps too soon in these situations, because you may actually chase the king into a safer position by your sort of constant checks. A simple plan, I think, to win would be d4 to d5, discovered check, and then black plays knight c6 to e5, Then you can play f2 to f4. That wins a piece. Now white's actual choice was to play rook c1 takes c6, the point of which escapes me, apart from a natural joie de vivre in a winning position. Black plays bishop b7 takes c6, white d4 to d5, discovered check, black e6 to e5, and white d5 takes c6. Now black plays rook c8 takes c6. So white hasn't actually sacrificed anything, and he still retains his attack. He now continued with f2 to f4, just putting pressure on the pinned piece. Black here chose g7 to g6. And I'd like you to switch off again and discover a brilliant move for white. Well, you could have played in mundane style with f4 takes e5 and then knight g5 to f3, and this really must eventually win by attacking the e5 square. But white chose the spectacular knight b3 to d4. And if black doesn't capture the knight, say he moves his rook now, then a discovered check from the knight at g5 will surely lead to a mate. So black played e5 takes d4, and you can choose your move again for white. Nice, precise move from white here. He didn't just capture on d4, which would, as I have said before, allow the black king to slip out of the net. He constructed the mating net with queen h4 to h7. The question is, don't let the king escape. Queen h4 to h7, threatening mate on f7. Black played bishop f8 to g7. White played bishop b2 takes d4 check. Now black can't move his king because the g7 bishop will fall, so he has to block. Rook e8 to e5. And now white played knight g5 to f3. That was quite enough for black, who here resigned. Everything is going to fall to pieces, and he's going to be left, well, at least a piece down and still with a mating attack against his king. This game earned the Brilliancy Prize for white, who was Koltanovsky, and it shows why the COLLE was such a popular opening in those days. You get a simple form of development, and there's always the chance of this sacrifice at h7. It turns up in many guises in the COLLE, and therefore you may get an exciting, spectacular win without actually too many risks to yourself in the opening stages of the game. I'd now like to look at another typical sequence in the COLLE, and this is where black himself tries for an early e6 to e5, mirroring, as it were, white's strategy. As, however, white's a move ahead, the opening up of the game should be favourable to him, from as it were, harmonise with pawn moves in the opening stages of the game. But the knight at d4 still hits the e4 square. Now black plays his bishop from f8 to d6. White castles. And here black comes out with his e6, e5. Now it's quite easy for white to get an inferior game here. I've seen plenty of junior games where white carries on automatically with c2 to c3, and then black plays e5 to e4, and then the child sort of wakes up and notices that his pieces have been forked. So we won't fall into that trap. Another automatic move that white might make, which is not the best, is to play d4 takes e5. Black plays knight d7 takes e5. White knight f3 takes e5. Black bishop d6 takes e5. And now again, automatic move, not very good. White plays knight d2 to f3, and bishop e5 goes back to d6. I'd like you to study this position for a few minutes before continuing. Now white appeared to gain a tempo on the bishop by playing his knight d2 to f3. In fact, he only lost control of the e4 square. It's now going to make it difficult for him to make the advance e3 to e4. In fact, in this position, it may often be black who has the superiority in the center. And if white can't play e4, then, in fact, his bishop at c1 may be badly locked in for the rest of the game. Now, in this particular position, I believe white still is okay. He can play something like b2 to b3, followed by bishop to b2. But a person who's got this far and made this number of mistakes in the opening may continue to make mistakes by sort of playing moves like queen to e2 and rook to e1 instead of developing his bishop at c1. And then black will just be able to castle and put his own rook on the e-file and completely shut white up in a box. Now, this type of position is one you want to avoid as white. You don't actually, as it were, want to have the inferior pawn position, with black having the pawn in the center and you having the more passive pawn at e3. You want it to be the other way around. Now let's return to diagram 1. And we're looking at the position after black's played e6 to e5. Now white's got to do something here. As we've noted, black's threatening to fork two pieces by e5 to e4. Now, solution is to push e3 to e4, opening the center before black has had time to castle. Now, let's see, what do you think will happen if black plays e5, takes d4 here? Well, if you recaptured automatically, this is not correct. What you can do is to win a piece. You can play e4 to e5. If black replies knight d7 takes e5, you play knight f3 takes e5, black bishop d6 takes e5, and now the pin comes in on the center file. Rook f1 to e1, followed by f2 to f4. And you win a piece. Black may get a couple of pawns for it, but this is not likely to be sufficient. Certainly not in the early stages of the game when the pawns, haven't got very much queening potential. Okay, let's go back again to diagram 1. And after black played e6, e5, white has played e3 to e4. We're going to look at another of Koltanovsky's games. And in that game, his opponent was Golmeo, and black played d5 takes e4 here. White played knight d2 takes e4, black knight f6 takes e4, white bishop d3 takes e4. This point, black walks straight into it with castles. What actually did he walk into? You may wish to switch off and work that one out. Well, he lost a pawn by the following sequence. d4 takes e5. Knight d7 takes e5. Knight f3 takes e5. Bishop d6 takes e5. And now bishop e4 takes h7 check. King g8 takes h7. Queen d1 to h5 check. King h7 to g8. Queen h5 takes e5. White eventually won a long ending. He's a pawn up, and even though black had bishops opposite colours, white's steady pressure eventually won the game. Now black can aim to play the move e6, e5 in more favourable circumstances, but white's general approach is to play the e3 to e4 move himself. I'd like to go now a little bit further down the main line of the COLLE and investigate a very important game. This was COLLE de Fosse, played in 1936 Belgium Championship. Let's go to the start position again. d4, knight f6, knight f3. This knight f3 move isn't just any old developing move. It does put pressure on the e5 square, and that makes it more difficult for black to play his e5 move. So knight f3, black plays d5, white e3, e6, bishop d3, c5. Black tries to take the initiative in the center, as white seems to be playing a crouching game. So white plays c3, black knight c6. White knight from b1 to d2, bishop from f8 to d6, white castles, and black castles. This is one of the standard positions of the COLLE, and white is now ready to make the push e3 to e4. However, a lot here depends on the placing of black's queen's knight, because different variations arise depending on whether it's at c6 or d7. On c6, white realizes that if he plays e3 to e4 now, black can isolate his d-pawn by playing c5 takes d4, white c3 takes d4, black d5 takes e4, white knight d2 takes e4. Now the isolated pawn isn't a great weakness, but at the same time white may prefer to play without it. So return to diagram 2 and see how white can avoid this possible weakness. He can play d4 takes c5, and now black plays bishop d6 takes c5. Now the white d4 takes c5 isn't very good if black's knight is at d7, because in that case black would capture with the knight from d7 and attack the white bishop at d3 and also attack the e4 square. So this would be positionally bad for white. However, now black has taken back with the bishop, white continues with e3 to e4. Now black can again try to go into the ending by d5 takes e4, white knight d2 takes e4, black knight f6 takes e4, white bishop d3 takes e4, black queen takes d1, white rook takes d1. However, in this position, white has got several small but tangible advantages. He has the open d-file, the black bishop at c8 can't come out, can't go to d7 without being captured, and most important, white has a potential passed pawn on the queen side. He's got 3 to 2, so by steadily advancing these pawns up, should be able to create a passed pawn, and then in the passage of time he may be able to push that through to actually make a queen out of it. Now let's return again to diagram 2. And here white's played d4 takes c5, black bishop takes c5, white e3 to e4, and we see here that white is now threatening to try and gain more space by playing e4 to e5. So black will usually do something about this. Either he'll play himself e6 to e5, or he'll play queen d8 to c7. Now look first at e6 to e5. White then exchanges e4 takes d5, black queen d8 takes d5, could also take with the knight, white queen d1 to e2, black bishop c8 to g4. Black seems to be coming in strongly. He has all these pieces quite well advanced, and he seems to be just about to bring his rooks to the center files as well. However, white's main trump here is that he has the e4 square. He hasn't lost control of that yet, so he can use that as a pivot point for his pieces. And also, his pawn at c3 is very useful to him. It prevents the black knight from c6 from coming into d4. So white would here continue knight d2 to e4. Black moves his bishop from c5 to e7. White rook f1 to d1. And here white has a promising position. Well, after that important divergence, we'll go back to diagram 3, which is part of the main line position, and see what else could be played. As we've said, white's threatening e4 to e5, so black could also play queen d8 to c7, which is less committal. White continues queen d1 to e2, and now again, rather than move his e-pawn, which may loosen his central position, black plays knight f6 to g4. He's hoping to use his e5 square to maneuver his pieces on. White played h2 to h3. Black knight g4 to e5. Now we have an interesting position where it was thought that white would need to retreat his bishop at d3 to sort of retain the bishop against the knight. But in this game, COLLE came up with a different idea. He played knight f3 takes e5. Black played knight c6 takes e5. e4 takes d5. e6 takes d5. And here, instead of retreating, white played knight d2 to f3. COLLE idea was that if black plays knight takes bishop, after queen takes knight, black's advantage of the two bishops is actually illusory, because the c8 bishop is severely hampered by the pawn at d5. In fact, white probably would have the advantage here because his knight would be able to place itself on a good central d4 square. He may be able to place something like bishop e3 as well to exchange off a pair of bishops, and then his other knight will be better than the c8 bishop, which doesn't go well with the pawn structure, particularly this isolated pawn at d5. In fact, after knight takes d3, queen takes d3, there's a rather amusing variation where black tries to break up white's kingside. He could play bishop c8 takes h3 here. I wonder what he would do in this case. Well, it wouldn't do you much good to take the bishop, because after queen g3 check, king h1, queen h3 check, king g1, black gets a draw by perpetual check at least. However, instead of taking the bishop, you have a good immediate refutation in knight f3 to g5. That threatens mate and the bishop at h3. So that scotches black's counter-attacking attempt. In the actual game, black didn't take on d3, Koltanovsky's game. Instead, he took the knight on f3. But it was more or less the same. White did have the advantage because of black's isolated pawn, and white eventually won the game. Now, this trip down the main line of the COLLE wouldn't be complete without looking at the other placement of the black knight, this time at d7. So let's go back to the start position and play once again. We play d2 to d4. Black d7 to d5, white knight g1 to f3, black knight g8 to f6, white e3, black e6, white now bishop d3, c5, c3, bishop e7, could go to d6, knight b1 to d2, knight b8 to d7, white castles, and so does black. Now, black is playing cagily with his pieces. He's hoping for a positional mistake by white. If white plays, say, d4 takes c5, when the reply knight d7 takes c5, attacks the white bishop d3, and prevents e3 to e4. Now, white could play here an immediate e3 to e4, but I feel that black is ready for that. He can play d5 takes e4, knight d2 takes e4, c5 takes d4, white c3 takes d4, black knight f6 takes e4, white bishop d3 takes e4, now black knight d7 to f6, the white bishop goes back to c2, and here b7 to b6, and black develops quite comfortably. He might even have the better game because of white's isolated pawn and the fact that the move d5 isn't going to be ever likely for white once black's bishop gets to b7. Now, if you'd return to diagram 4, and in order to give white's game a bit more push, we can delay the central advance e3, e4, and we can play some preparatory move like queen d1 to e2, or in this case we'll play rook f1 to e1. Now, this move puts black in a quandary. We'll see what possible moves he has here. He has chosen b6, after which white would then open with e4. He could try queen c7, and he's played rook e8 as well. Now, look at a couple of examples. This one, COLLE against O'Hanlon, and black played rook e8. Now, actually black's bishop was on d6 here, so I'll put the bishop on d6. White now opened with e4, d takes e4, knight takes e4, black played knight takes e4, and white played bishop takes e4. And here black was unwise. Should have played knight f6, I should think. But instead he innocently continued with pawn takes pawn, thinking white would just simply recapture the pawn. However, white did not do this. What did he in fact do? White played bishop takes h7 check, king takes h7, knight g5 check, king to g6. Now, you may have seen this before, but all positions in chess are different, and if you just sort of play things by rote, you'll get into trouble. So you've got to switch off again and decide how would you actually continue this attack, because basically it's no use knowing the themes if you can't yourself follow them up. So turn off and decide what you'd play for white here. Now, the choice of move that O'Hanlon made was to play, COLLE played was to play h4 with the threat of h5 check, and then if the king goes to f6, white goes queen f3 check. And the natural response to that was played by O'Hanlon, which was rook to h1. Okay, now turn off again and decide how you'd play again for white. Well, it's a tribute for Colle's brilliance that he never played his attacks automatically. He did manage to work them out on the board. And here, his next move was rook takes e6 check, f takes e6, and now came queen d3 check. Well, that would win pretty quickly. So, because if king f6, queen f3 check, king e5, knight to f7 mate, or if king e7, queen to f7 mate. So in fact, after rook takes e6 check, if you put some of those pieces back, the white queen's on d1, white rook's on e6 now, and the black pawn's still on f7, and the black king on g6. So rook takes e6 was answered by knight to f6. Okay, now how does white continue now? His next move was h5 check. This is, I believe, was because if he plays queen d3 check, black can escape with moving his king to h5. So this is sort of a move to block up one of black's escape routes. h5 check. Black has to take with the rook, and that takes away a flight square from the king. So white could now complete with queen d3 check, king to h6, and, well, we could win the queen by knight takes f7 check, but why not win the king with queen to h7 mate? Yeah, lovely game, that. Well, we'll finish this side by going back to diagram 4, and white's played rook e1, and look at a different continuation for black, which is queen c7. Now this is a natural square for the black queen, but it isn't very good if black opens up the c-file, which, as we can see, he does, because white here played e4, and black was foolish enough to play c5 takes d4, white c3 takes d4, d takes e4, knight takes e4. Here black tried b6, preparing to let his bishop go on d3, at least let it be exchanged, in the hope of getting a good blockade on the d4 square. And interestingly enough, white didn't take it. He went straight for the attack with bishop to g5. He's now got about 4 pieces pointing at the king's side, 4 or 5 maybe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. And his development is looking really fantastic. Black played knight takes knight, and here again the obvious move for white is to play bishop takes knight, hitting the rook at a8, but instead rook takes e4 was played here, just going straight for the kingside attack. Very effective use of rooks. Now bishop to b7, hitting the rook. What do you think white played now? Yeah, once again white played sharp move, rook c1. If you don't play sharply, you don't win games, and finding these little extra strong moves instead of the automatic move is what makes the difference between a strong and a weak player. Rook c1, queen had to go back to b8. Now white played rook h4, hitting the h7 square, and of course if now black plays h6, white will sack on there and smash through. And black played g6. So how would you now continue for white? Again, another surprise move, which shows how inventive white's play has been and should be if he's going to score the full point. This was bishop to b5. It virtually wins outright, this move, because the black knight got nowhere to go, and black had to put himself in virtually a self-pin by playing queen e8 to save the poor fellow, after which white just played knight e5, and black was in tremendous trouble trying to save that poor knight at d7. COLLE system side 2. I'd like to start this side with some cautionary tales, because when an amateur actually plays an opening on the board, he will always find that things don't quite go as he expected, and often they go considerably worse. Doesn't mean that you should abandon any attempt to study chess at all. You just got to realize that studying chess is not the same as studying any other subject, where you learn something and then you're tested on exactly what you know. In chess you might learn an opening and learn it quite well, but then your opponent will find some other continuation which you haven't looked into too deeply, and you're going to have to be thrown on your own resources. The solution to this is to sort of accept it, that this is the way chess is. You can't account for everything, but then there is a real satisfaction in actually being able to prepare something and to more or less get it to work in practice. And of course, if you play an opening and you find it has gone wrong, you'll find that even the experience of it going wrong is very useful for increasing your understanding of the opening, because you always have another chance in a game next week or next month. Now here's a game between a couple of amateurs which appeared in Rabbit's Review 18, and we can see how white did not play the opening correctly, and he got the worst of it. It began d4, knight f6, e3, d5, bishop d3, and now black played knight c6, which is quite a common sort of move. It would normally be prefaced by black trying for c5, but in this case black is going to try for e5. Now white has already made a slight error, I believe, in not bringing his knight out to f3 previously, and he's brought his bishop out first, so in this case knights before bishops would have been better. Now after knight to qb3, that's knight to c6 that black played, white played pawn to c3. Again, I feel white should have played either f4. I think f4 could have been a very effective move here. It's turning the game into a sort of stone wall, where white gets this sort of reversed V shape of pawns in the center, and he follows up by bringing his knight from g1 to f3, and later it can come into e5, a really strong post. Now there are methods of combating this system, but it often proves just as deadly as the COLLE against play such as black's, which has been rather unsubtle in just bringing his knights out and not getting his pawns working. So f4 would have been good here, I think, and also knight f3. Now the move white chose was in line with the COLLE structure, but just maybe at the wrong moment. He played c3. This possibly is to stop black's knight getting to b4. But what do you think black played here? Yes, black played the natural move e7 to e5, and white is already put on the defensive. Here white, I believe, probably should have taken the pawn. Instead he played knight d2, and black could have got maybe a space advantage by playing e4. So what he played was okay. Bishop d6, and now another rather strange move by white, h2 to h3. I can see what his problem is. He wants to bring his knight to f3, but he's afraid there may be a fork by e5 to e4, or possibly even worse. He's well, not quite so bad, but possibly the bishops from c8 may come to g4 and pin his knight. So he played h3 because he couldn't think of anything to do. I think he should have just played d takes e5, or even e4. No, e4 doesn't work, probably lose a pawn. So d takes e5, and then after black plays knight takes e5, white could drop his bishop back to c2 or e2. Has the worst game, but I think that's better than making non-moves like h3. So white played h3, black castled, and now white finally did capture. D takes e5, black played knight takes e5. White moved his bishop back to c2. Black played rook e8. So already black's got the sort of position that white was aiming for. Domination in the center, and we can see here white's bishop at c1 isn't going to get out very easily. It's blocked by its pawn on e3, and white's not going to be able to play his e4 move. White continued with knight to f3. Black went c5. White played knight takes knight. Black played bishop takes knight, and white castled. Let's see, what do you think black should play here? Well, black has some nice possibilities against the white king side. Instead he played pawn to b5, which seemed a bit irrelevant. I'd have played bishop from e5 back to c2, with a fairly blunt threat of moving queen to d6 and threatening mate on h2. White could, of course, prevent this by playing his knight to f3, but then his chances of playing e4 even less, and black's got a pretty comfortable game. He can just sit on white quite heavily. Right, now black actually played b5, and white now played knight to f3. Black now played bishop b7. Doesn't make sense to me why he allowed his bishop to be exchanged, which looks so strong. White played knight takes e5, black rook takes e5. White queen f3, black queen to e7, white queen to g3, black knight to e4. Still with the advantage to black, for the simple reason that white cannot develop his bishop at c1 and it's painfully locked in. Well, we won't go any further into this game. We'll just recall our advice from the other side that white should pay attention to black's attempts to play e5 himself, and if black looks like he's getting ready to it for playing it, white must respond almost immediately with his own e4 and hope that the opening of the center will be in his favor, because he will be a move ahead. And often, as we saw in one of the games, because white had castled and black hadn't, black's king got into difficulty in the middle of the board. Now, another typical thing that often goes wrong with the COLLE is concerning the white squares. And we'll have a look at this. White goes d4, black goes d5, white knight f3, black knight to f6, white goes e3. Now here black can play e6, but he may choose to be awkward, as many opponents do, and develop his bishop from c8 either to f5 or g4. If it goes to f5, the automatic way to play again is to play bishop f1 to d3. And this isn't really good for a couple of reasons. In the first place, even if black exchanges, white takes back with the queen. There's been a certain simplification, and also the bishop at c1 doesn't go well with the pawn chain. And black can be even more awkward. He can play moves like, say, g7 to g6 instead of exchanging the bishops. And then if white plays bishop takes f5, black plays g takes f5. It looks like black has a poor position, but his big advantage is that he can now play e6, and he's thoroughly prevented white from playing the e4 move. And this means that white will be left with his permanently bad bishop. This is something to be avoided. Also, after bishop f5, white bishop to d3, black could even try e6, hoping for bishop takes f5, e takes f5. And again, black has got his positional plan, which is to prevent the e4 move happening. He's exchanged off the white squared bishops, and white is left with a bad bishop. Actually, if you set up the position in diagram 5, we'll look at a short game, or part of a short game, between two juniors, which shows us this theme. After black's bishop f5, white played pawn c3, black went knight to c6, white went bishop to b5, black played pawn e6. White now played knight e5, putting pressure on the knight at c6. Now black defended with queen to d6. White very logically brought his queen from d1 to a4, putting pressure again on the knight at c6. Black answered with knight f6 to d7, and white played bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, queen takes c6, black queen takes c6, white knight takes c6, and black moved bishop to d6. The interesting thing about this game was that white, though he had won a pawn, really gained no particular advantage because of the positional difficulties he had with freeing his game, in particular his bishop at c1. He probably could have, if he'd have realized what was going on, and he'd have taken great steps to, say, play b3 and something like bishop a3 to try and get rid of his bad bishop. But he didn't realize this. He just thought he was a pawn up and that would be good enough. But the more significant factors which give black at least equality are the fact that the white pawns are all on black squares and the white bishop is on a black square as well, and he has no white square control whatsoever. Now let's see, how do we actually avoid this sort of situation occurring? Well, it's quite simple. Let's go back to diagram 5. So this is diagram 5 after black's played his bishop to f5 move. Now the simple answer for white is to play c4 here. If you remember anything about the Queen's Gambit, you'll know that black doesn't usually bring out his queen's bishop because he often gets attacked on the b7 square, and this can be awkward to him if he hasn't yet castled. So what white does is to more or less transpose back into the Queen's Gambit and try to put pressure on the queen's side. So he totally abandons any attempt to play e4, and this idea must be borne in mind if you're going to play the COLLE. Be ready to go back into playing Queen's Gambit lines. Now in this game against Conde, black played c6, white exchanged the pawns, and now played knight to c3. Black played e6, and white played queen to b3, immediately putting pressure on the b7 spot. Now black has got some problems here about how to defend the pawn. He has several moves he could try. He could go queen e7, but this would block his bishop in at f8. He could play queen d7, but that would allow white to play knight e5. He could put his queen to c7, but this may also be awkward if white ever plays knight b5. He could play queen c8, as in the game. He could also try b6, but b6 could be very awkward if white does something like bishop to b5 check, especially as black isn't able to bring his bishop back from f5 back to d7. So bishop b5 check, knight d7, white coming in with knight to e5, and there's already a chance that black may lose something on the d7 square because of the tremendous pins being set up now on that spot. Now black can also try queen b6, and in that case white will just exchange the queens, leaving black with rather weak doubled pawns on the queen's side. And after exchanging the queens too, white would then be able to follow up with knight to b5, and that threatens knight c7 check. Well, in this particular case, black would be able to play his knight to a6, but all the same, white's knight at b5 is well placed, and he may later be able to make something out of the weakened pawns at b7 and b6. Now, in this game, black defended with queen to c8, but this is always going to be positionally dangerous because the queen will have to face a rook along the open file. White immediately had played bishop d2, black played bishop e7, and white played rook to c1. Black played knight to c6. White's next move was quite logical, knight to e5, putting pressure on c6, and black castled. This, according to Koltanowski, wasn't the best. Black should have played knight d7. Now, white started to put pressure against c6. He played knight to a4. He's not yet bothering to castle. He's too busy putting pressure on the c6 square. So after knight a4, black played bishop d6. And white played bishop to b5, already threatening to win a pawn, so black had to play bishop takes e5, pawn takes e5, knight to d7. Now black's threatening to win a pawn, but white reacted combinatively here. What do you think he played? He played bishop to b4, rook e8, and now bishop to d6, totally tying the black position up. Black now decided to jettison a bit of material. He played queen d8, white played bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6. And now what would you play for white here? Well, white could have taken the pawn on c6, but a pawn as weak as that is going to be very hard to defend. It can't move forward without being captured. It has to be supported by pieces of its own side. So eventually, if white just builds up along the c-file, he's going to pick it off. So he castled kingside instead of taking the pawn. Why make complications? Black played f6. White took, and black took, threatening the bishop. And now white did take the pawn, and he stayed a pawn up in this game, which he later won. So remember those possible pitfalls in the COLLE, and against black's bishop f5, remember to go into the c4 moves, and I think that goes also if black plays bishop g4. Well, a lot of the examples we've been looking at are from games of about 50 years ago. So in case you think nobody ever plays the COLLE nowadays, we'll look at the game from the 1984 British Championship. This is Basman against Fleer. And Fleer is an international master with ELO of about 2,440. So he's no pushover. Let's start from the beginning. d4, black plays d5, white knight f3, black knight f6, white e3, and black reacts with c5. White now played c3. Now, as I said, your openings are never always going to go quite as you expect them to go, and this is no exception. The standard move for black might be to play knight d7 or possibly e6, and let's note that black, if he played something like bishop f5 here, whereupon we wouldn't play c4 because we've already played c3, after black plays bishop f5, white would probably play d takes c5 and then support his pawn with b4. A little nuance, black can't just leave his pawn on c5 forever unprotected. So in this game, black chose a new move, which is probably rubbish, but anyway, it's worth a try. He played queen to d6. Now, the logic behind this move is that black, as quickly as possible, wants to play pawn e7 to e5. And so he's going to bring his knight to c6 or d7. But at the same time, he doesn't want to move his pawn from e7 because he wants to get to e5 in one go. But then he's got to defend his pawn at c5 if he's going to do that. So that's why he plays queen d6, solving the problem perfectly. The only problem with this move might be that black's queen may be exposed in the center. So working along these lines, white chose a sharp answer. I mean, white could have played something like bishop d3, knight d2, castles. But by that time, black would have played knight c6 and e5 and would take the advantage in the center. So white is not prepared to let black get the advantage in the center and played here c3 to c4. This moves the pawn twice, but white is hoping that he can gain time later against the black queen. Now, after c4, black played c takes d, white played e takes d, and black played d5 takes c4, Now, what would you play for white here? Well, you would of course take the pawn, because black actually cannot win your bishop with queen b4 check. You would just play knight to d2, defending it. So bishop takes c4. We've actually transposed this as something very similar to what was called the Moro Gambit against the Sicilian. Or sometimes they play it 2c3 against the Sicilian. And it's not clear who has actually got the better of this deal. I believe that white has, but I might be wrong. Here black played e6. White castled. Black played bishop e7. White went knight to c3. And black castled. And here I could have continued quite quietly with some sort of move. I don't know what. Queen e2 and rook d1, maybe bishop g5. But I thought I would try something, see what happened. So I played knight b5 here, hitting the black queen, which immediately retreated to d8. And now I was able to play bishop to f4 to get the bishop actively placed and also threatening to come in onto c7. Now these sorts of maneuvers aren't always successful, as we shall see when we look at the result, the continuation of the game. I think I was hoping, of course, black would play knight a6, and if he has to play that, then white must be better, because the knight on a6 is not well placed, and black is not able to get rid of white's knight at b5. However, black was not willing to acquiesce in this continuation, but called the fire upon himself, as they say in the Soviet Union, by playing a7 to a6. And white, again, having little choice, moved his knight into c7. We know he doesn't want to go backwards. So knight to c7, hitting the rook, and the rook went up to a7. Right, the problem here for white now is that he's faced with a threat like b7 to b5, followed by rook takes c7, and his knight on c7 is slightly stranded. So white has to push forward immediately to get his knight out of a jam. So he plays d5, and here I think I had a long think, and Flair also had a long think about the possible consequences of black playing, well, several moves. One of his moves was bishop to d6. I wonder what you think white should do against that. Well, against bishop d6, I'd planned some hairy variation with d takes e6. Black plays bishop takes f4. White e takes f7 check. Black plays king to h8. White queen takes d8. Black rook takes d8. And now, what should white play? Next move is white knight to e8, and this rather uncomfortably threatens pawn equals queen and checkmate. So black would now have to jettison his rook by rook takes e8. White pawn takes rook equals queen check, answered by knight takes e8. Now if we look at this position, white has got a rook against two pieces. He's got a rook and a pawn against two pieces, which isn't normally any good. But in this position, the rooks can very quickly come to the central files and completely overrun black before black would be able to reorganize his position. So I was quite happy that this position I would be able to win if Flair went into it. Let's return to diagram 6. So back to diagram 6. Actually, Flair pointed out that after bishop d6, I didn't need to play d takes e6. Even more crushing was knight takes e6. And after pawn takes e6 by black, white could play d takes e6. And then if black plays bishop takes f4, white just plays pawn e7, discovered check, winning the black queen. So he, for that reason, abandoned the variation. And there was another continuation possible from diagram 6, and that was for black to play b7 to b5. And white has various continuations here, like d6, or knight takes b5, knight takes b5, a takes b5, bishop takes b8, rook b7, d6 is one possible line. We weren't able to discover anything that clear in the position for white, so I'm not sure if b5 wasn't the best move. It might have given black at least equality. At any rate, if you have a spare couple of hours, you might like to analyze this position after black b5 and perhaps write up to me and tell me who would get the better of the sequence. Okay, now Fleer here didn't choose b5. He had some reasons, but we won't go into them. Instead, he decided just to simplify the position and played e takes d5. White now played knight takes d5, sigh of relief, got him out. Black knight takes d5, white bishop takes d5, with a really totally dominating position for white, as you can see. Lovely bishops, and black's rook on a7 not looking too good. Now black here played knight d7. He could have gone to c6, but anyway, he didn't want his pawns to be shattered, I imagine. So he played knight d7. Now in this position, white has a problem. He has a dominating position, but how does he actually make use of it? Now, my solution here was to actually start to play a bit quicker, because I had spent a bit of time on the opening. I was running behind on the clock, or running level, so I speeded up my play, even if that meant I made some, second-rate moves in some cases, because I knew later on in the game the advantage in time would stand me in good stead if I got into complications. But it's no use getting to a good position about move 30 and you've got 10 minutes left on the clock and then you blow it all. It's better to to get to move 30 with an hour left on the clock and maybe a slightly bad position. Much more practical way to play. So here I don't think I made the best of the position, but maybe if I'd spent longer I still wouldn't have found the best moves. Anyway, played here rook e1, black went bishop to c5. Here I think I did have a definite chance to go knight g5, and black would have been in real trouble, because if he goes knight f6, white plays bishop takes f7 check, and black can't play rook takes f7 without dropping his queen. So knight g5 was a definite chance I missed. I played rook c1, and now black played b6. At this point, knight g5 is not on, because after knight f6, the rook on a7 defends f7, so bishop takes f7 isn't on anymore. So after b6, white just held the position with bishop to b3, black pawn to h6, bishop g3, black bishop to b7. Now here white was starting to try and double his rooks, but he saw rook c2 might be answered by bishop b4. So first he plays a3, black a5, now rook c2, a4, bishop a2. Now Fleer began to become rather confident, because white hasn't seemed to be doing much with the position, and so he decided to take over the initiative, which wasn't a good idea, as you'll see. He played queen d8 to a8, lining up his pieces against the white king side, but in general his position doesn't inspire confidence. The pieces are rather scattered about, and the black rook's on a7. Of course, white can't play queen takes d7 here, because bishop takes f3. But first, white plays knight h4. This exploits the real weakness of black's game, is that he's got nothing on his own king side. So this knight's just going to wander into f5, and the queen's going to come to g4, and black's going to be mated. Okay, knight h4. Black played knight f6, stopping this queen g4 move, and white played bishop e5, sorry. And black now played rook to d8, hitting the white queen, but also taking another defender away from his king position. So white played rook d2, black rook d2, white queen takes d2, and now black knight to e4. Now perhaps you might like to have a look at this position and decide what you'd do for white here. Well, do not be afraid. It looks like white's in trouble because black's threatening bishop takes f2 check. But white, in principle, feeling that he should be winning here because black has got no kingside defense, launches into his own attack, which is bishop takes f7 check. And this attack should really give him the advantage. Bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, queen d7 check, bishop to e7, queen f5. Now if black plays something like knight f6, white will finish him off with bishop takes f6, followed by various other nasties. So black had to move his king to e8. White followed up with queen g6 check, black king d8, white rook to d1 check, black bishop to d5. Now here I had the hallucination. I could see that white could play queen takes e4, get his piece back with the better position. Black would then play probably rook to d7, and black is a pawn down, but he has got some play in this position because white's pieces are slightly awkwardly placed. So I was looking for something better and came up with queen to e6. The plan was to answer black's rook d7 with queen to g8 mate. However, the last moment after black's rook d7, I noticed that queen g8 would be answered by bishop takes queen. Now this was something of a shattering blow, because now I was a piece down without compensation, without anyway enough compensation, and what was looking like an easy win was going to turn into a quite definite loss. And in those sorts of situations, you just have to pick up the pieces and find the best moves possible. It's no use jumping up and tearing your hair and screaming. You have to make the best of a bad job. And I was helped a bit by the earlier decision I'd made, which was to play a bit quicker, and therefore I had some plus on the clock. Maybe I had 20-30 minutes, and Fleer only had say 3 or 4 minutes. And this, even though Fleer played very well for a long period of time after this, we'll see what happened when we got to the time control. Queen takes, after rook d7 I played queen b6 check, king e8, knight wandered into f5, planning something or other. Now black reacted sharply, queen to c6, just bringing his pieces onto strong squares. See how black now dominates the board virtually. Knight takes g7, rather futile little check, king to f7, queen had to go back to e3 to try and keep a few attacking chances against a king who is fast disappearing into the safety of a little hole. Black went bishop c5, queen f4 check, king g8. And now white is really in quite a lot of trouble, but tried for some play with knight to f5. Black played bishop takes f2 check, king h1, queen g6. Right, so this is move 39, and there was one move to the time control. Black's got about a few seconds left on the clock. White's got maybe, I don't know, 10-15 minutes. So you've got to make the most of this move. Either find clearly winning move, or at least something to confuse black if you think you're losing. Okay, switch off and decide. Well, I was looking at rook takes d5, and maybe you also are looking at that. If black plays rook takes d5, white can continue to win the black queen by knight e7 check, knight e7 check, king h7. But knight takes queen is no good because of the mate on d1. However, what I hadn't seen was that white could actually just take the rook on d5, and this position is maybe better for him. Now, thinking that my position was in a bad way, I therefore found a move which Fleer never considered at all, mainly because he was spending all his time while he was waiting for the move to work out rook takes d5, rook takes d5, knight e7 check, and knight d5. He was considering whether knight g3 check was any good for him. Anyway, the move white played was bishop d6, and there are several ways to take this piece, but none of them is good. In fact, the best move here is not to capture at all, just to leave the bishop there and play bishop back to b6 for black. And after that, I think white is definitely in trouble, because if he plays rook takes d5, then knight f2 check, king g1, knight h3 double check, and the white queen has to part from company with the squares of the board. Now, a move like bishop c5, sort of retreating and not capturing anything, is particularly difficult to see when you haven't got much time left on the clock. So Fleer actually captured the bishop. He could have taken with the knight. Knight takes bishop on d6. But then white would play rook takes d5, and all the array of pins actually work in his favor. Instead, Fleer chose rook takes d6, which now white swooped in with knight e7 check, king g7, knight takes g6. Now black's best was to play rook f6, and if queen g4, rook takes g6, queen to f5, and I believe black should lose this position. He's got too many pieces loose. Instead of rook f6, Fleer chose an inferior move. He went bishop back to c5, and white finished off very quickly. I wonder if you could see what he plays. White plays queen f8 check, king takes g6, and now rook takes d5. If rook takes d5, white forks on g8, so black played knight to f2 check, but white just finished off with queen takes f2, and now rook takes d5 happened by black, queen c2 check, king g5, g3, and black resigned. His position is pretty hopeless. Now I'd like to end this game with another recent game played September 1984, and this is Basman against Gaffney from the GLC tournament. It's also a rather unusual sort of series of moves. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, e3, and here black played his bishop f5, which, as I said, should be met by c4, which is what I played. Now black presumably should play something to support his center. Instead he played knight c6, clearly planning to bring his knight round to b4 and try a few forks on c2. Now we're not too worried about that. I played c takes d5. Now, of course, knight b4 is met by queen a4 check, which wins the piece. So black played knight takes d5. Now, if white plays a bit carelessly, he might end up in trouble on the c2 square. I suppose one could play quietly with bishop e2. But I chose more actively to play bishop to b5, and black moved his knight from d5 to b4. Now again, I can play passive with knight a3, but instead chose castles. The sacrifice of the rook on a1 is very likely to be successful because one can get all sorts of advantages in time, center control, even pawns, and one is not necessarily losing the rook on a8 because you can usually trap that knight when it tries to get out. So black thought for some time after castles. I mean, he was looking at knight c2. I wonder what you think white should do against that. Well, I was considering something like knight h4, and then that's one idea. And then if knight takes a1, then knight takes f5. And now if queen to d5 by black, also a natural move, I think white can go queen to a4. And black here would not be able to play queen takes f5 without allowing bishop takes c6 check. So this looks fairly good compensation for white for his sacrifice material. As I said, there might be other moves, but Gaffney decided not to risk it. Instead, he went bishop takes b1, which looks an absolutely deplorable move. After rook takes b1, he played queen d5, forking the pawn on a2 and the bishop at b5. But if all he's going to get is a measly measly pawn on a2, it won't compensate for the loss of his strong bishop and also for white's burgeoning central control. White just played queen e2, and here again black can take the pawn on a2, but after bishop to d2 his position is a really bad mess. So again, after coming forward, black decided to retreat after queen to a2. He played a6, white played bishop c4, black went queen d7. And now white had a wonderful time kicking black's knights into oblivion. a3, knight to d5, e4, knight to b6, d5, knight took on c4, queen took on c4, knight to a5, queen c3. Well, this is a pretty good position to get after 15 moves of a quiet collie. Really fine control of the center, 2 pawns preventing black from developing properly, and black's going to have trouble with his king as well. He chose to play b6, white played b4, knight b7, now knight e5, hitting the queen. Queen went to d6, bishop f4. And again, a lot of trouble for black. He went and played g5, and white won some material now. Knight takes f7, queen takes f4, knight takes h6. White has to be careful his knight doesn't get trapped in the corner. Black now played a good move. He castled queenside. White played rook b1 to c1, rook d7, g3, black queen takes e4, white knight went to f7, black played here queen takes d5, should have gone queen f5, rook d1, black now had to give up his queen by queen takes d1 check, but his position was completely hopeless. Okay, well, look forward to hearing of your results and successes with your new opening, the COLLE.